Hey everyone, welcome to the Christ Pearls channel. This is Jessica, and today we're going to pick up where we left off in our Marriage Motif series entitled The Best Is Yet to Come, Prepare You for the Coming of the Bridegroom. And in this particular segment, we're going to start talking about the temple and use the marriage motif as a lens for understanding some of the changes and things that we've seen in recent years in the temple drama. The question that I want us to think about as we go through this is, what can we learn by viewing our temple ritual through the lens of the Hebrew marriage motif? And the obvious things, I think, are going to be the symbols, like the same kinds of symbols that we see on the temple, in the furniture, the motifs that we see in the design, in the patterns, as well as the clothing, just some of the rituals themselves. But in addition, I want to think a little bit about how we've seen our rituals change. So, as many know, the temple ritual has been updated many times in church history for many reasons. And in 2019 and 2020, the church updated the temple ritual significantly. Some of this was because of the pandemic, but even in 2019, before the pandemic started, there were some changes made to the temple drama. And there's been more since then. Just this year, in 2024, we saw additional changes made to the temple drama. It's actually gotten a little bit shorter, and it's been left a little bit more to interpretation, I would say. And there's been some mixed feelings about that I've noticed. I've talked to people, I've seen people commenting online about it. And I just want to look at it through this specific lens of the marriage motif, and then try to see how it affects the way that we think about the symbols and the changes that we've seen. And, we may continue to see additional changes. And of all of the recent changes, there were a few that stood out to me that I felt were very noteworthy, especially when looking at them through the lens of the marriage motif. And so I put together these 3 examples of ritual changes that we can use as an example for how to use the marriage motif to maybe gain some insights about the church's collective preparation for the second coming of the Lord in relation to the changes that we've seen. So for example, and I'm sure there are more examples than this, but these were the 3 big ones that I felt I could very easily draw parallels to. And the first one is the structure. So we had kind of like an old ritual structure that we would see in the temple drama. And I don't want to get too specific, but if you've been to the temple, you'll understand what I'm talking about. And if you went to the temple, particularly prior to 2019, then you'll definitely understand what I'm talking about. But essentially, we would see this structure where Adam, he is essentially having this covenant interaction with Jesus Christ, and then Eve is having this covenant interaction with Adam. And in the new changes, this ritual structure is adjusted to where we see Adam and Eve both having this covenant interaction with Jesus Christ, essentially at the same time. And so it's tweaked just slightly. And I felt like this was a pretty big change. I remember when I went to the temple, I was kind of surprised by it. And I mean, I would say pleasantly surprised. I'm always happy with temple changes. I don't ever really feel that any of them are wrong or bad, or I don't feel critical of them. I feel like for me, it's more of a learning experience. And so that's how I want to look at this today. I want to use this motif to help learn from these changes. The other thing that I noticed were just the robes and the shoes and some of the clothing rituals that we would do. I noticed how not only was the ceremony just cut shorter, we cut out some things that we used to do, which I think there's been mixed emotions about, but just the ritual itself, I think, the fact that we don't really incorporate certain aspects of the clothing changes. So for example, in the old ritual, there was this incorporation of shoes as part of our ritual. And there was also this incorporation of both an Aaronic style priesthood robe and then a Melchizedek style priesthood robe. But with the new ritual, we don't incorporate shoes anymore into the ritual. And we really just focus on the Melchizedek priesthood robes as part of our ritual. And there was also an emphasis added on wearing the priesthood garment appropriately, which seemed to be something that's been emphasized in General Conference too in recent years. So these are some of those changes that I noticed, and it shortened the temple ritual a lot. And for me, I could not see this as a bad thing because I have a lot of family who needs temple work done, and the endowment has always been the bottleneck. So I've always viewed the shorter endowment as just a relief because I feel pressure. I want to be able to do this temple work for my family, but it is really hard, especially as a parent of little children, to go and do these rituals when you have to mark out like 3 or 4 hours of time to just do one. And so anytime it can be a little shorter, I've been pleased with that. But in addition, I've tried to look at these changes with the clothing, the shortening of the ritual through the lens of this marriage motif and with the thought of preparing for the second coming of the Lord in mind. So I want to talk about these two things. And then the third one that I want to talk about, which I'm going to put into a separate video, is the veils. This one I think has, at least in my circle of friends, been discussed the most. It was the first change that I felt I was seeing some really strong emotions about. And in the old ritual, women would wear a veil, and a veil covering was incorporated into the temple ritual. So at like a certain place in the temple, we would use the veils to veil our faces. But under the new changes, we still wear veils, but we don't use them as a covering any longer. Like the idea of covering the face is not incorporated into the ritual anymore. And so I saw a lot of mixed emotions about this, and this is really the buildup. This is where we're going to go with this, because I want to think about the idea of veiling and unveiling. And I would like to call your mind back to previous videos where we talked about Joseph in Egypt and how he had a veiled identity. And he was a Hebrew, a covenant, birthright son who appeared as an Egyptian king, basically, to his own family. And then his identity was unveiled. And we talked about that in his story, and I want you to think about that. But we're not going to get to the veils in this video because I have so much material prepared for that it is going to be its own video, and it will be hopefully just like the buildup that we've been waiting for. So in this video, we're going to talk about these first two things, this structure change, and then these robes and shoes and these changes, and apply this lens. So Let's look at the structure first. Formerly, we had this structure where we'd see Adam to Christ and Eve to Adam. And now we're seeing Adam and Eve both to Christ in this covenant structure, the way that they're covenanting and kind of doing this ritual ceremony. And under this old ritual, it sort of alludes to like an idea of spiritual preparation. And the way that I see this preparation is from the concept of there being an intermediary. If we go back to the marriage motif where Jesus is the bridegroom and the church is the bride, then we can see Adam as a type of Christ and Eve as a type for the church. So we've talked a little bit about how it's normal for us to go to the temple and for women to consider themselves as Eve and identify with Eve, and men to consider themselves as Adam and identify with Adam. And there is application there. I mean, there obviously is, because we're asked to do that. And, you can derive many ideas from that. Like, for example, one would be that, men can see themselves as being that provider and presider that the family proclamation talks about. So you can look at it kind of on that individual level. You can also look at it collectively, like, men who bear the priesthood have this responsibility to care for the church, which Eve can represent, and as well as their families, their wives and their children. So there's different applications there. But if we're going to look at it from the perspective of the collective, and we're going to look at it through the marriage motif lens on that collective level of Eve representing the church and Adam representing Christ, then it changes what we see. So for instance, if Adam represents Christ and Eve represents the church under the old ritual structure, then we can derive this idea of spiritual preparation from the concept of an intermediary. Because what we see happening there is that we have Jesus, who would be represented by Adam, standing in between God, who would be represented by Jesus in that original ritual structure in the drama, and then Eve still representing the church. We see basically the story of Jesus and what he does for us as the advocate with the Father. When Eve partakes of the fruit, if we think of Adam as a type of Christ, then we can see that Jesus, he condescended. He chose to follow us here down to earth and be with us if we are Eve and we are the church, to save the church, to save God's children, and make sure that he could bring to pass the immortality and eternal life the way that Heavenly Father set out to do, to fulfill the plan. And so I think in that way we can see how Jesus and Adam, they tell that story just in the Genesis story, if we're looking at it through that lens. And so we'll see this kind of intermediary happening where Adam is, facing God, and he's covenanting with God, and then we see Eve covenanting with Adam, and that's pretty much our relationship with Jesus Christ, right? We covenant with him, and he covenants with the Father, and he brings us back into the presence of the Father. And if you think about the marriage motif, then we can see how there's that time where there's the betrothal, and if Jesus is the bridegroom and the church is the bride, or Adam is representing the bridegroom and Eve the bride, then we see that there's this time of kind of like a distance or an intermediary is the go-between between us and our God. And under this new way of portraying the same story, we see Adam and Eve side by side, and both of them facing Jesus and covenanting directly with him. And I think what's so interesting about this is it doesn't necessarily change the concept of the fact that we need Jesus Christ, but to me, it showed something different than what I noticed before, which is there's more of a directness rather than this intermediary structure. And this reminded me a little bit about the idea of the Davidic covenant, and maybe even on some level the Sinai covenant, because these are covenants that were requiring an intermediary. So under the Sinai covenant, the children of Israel collectively had to keep the Ten Commandments, and Moses was their intermediary. And then under the Davidic covenant, the children of Israel collectively had to keep David's law, and David was their intermediary with the Lord. But with the new and everlasting covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, we have the ability to have this direct access to Jesus Christ. And in this last dispensation, in the restoration, we've had this ability. And at least on an individual level, I feel like this has always been a thing for us in this dispensation through the temple. But maybe collectively, this is something that has required some spiritual preparation for us as a church to grow to the level of preparation that could collectively get us to a point where we are spiritually ready and prepared as the bride adorned and ready to meet the bridegroom at his second coming. And so that was kind of what was coming to my mind as I have just mentally taken note of these changes and pondered on them and just kind of kept them in my heart and thought about them over these last 5-ish years. And it's something that I feel is speaking to me, especially after the last General Conference, when President Nelson quoted Isaiah 9:6 and talked a lot about the second coming of the Lord and being prepared. So these are some of these ideas here about this old structure versus this new structure, where we see that Adam, he, under the old structure, could even represent maybe the friend of the bridegroom in the motif. Like the friend acts as an intermediary between the bride and the groom during the time of preparation and separation. And the prophet of God and the Holy Ghost combined can act as the friend of the bridegroom. The friend is responsible for communication between the couple during the separation, and also for ensuring that the bride will be prepared and ready for the wedding when the call comes, like in the 10 virgins. And we need to maintain harmony between our personal line of communication via the Holy Ghost and our authoritative line of communication via the prophet in order to receive true messages from the Lord, to be able to hear him, to receive personal revelation. So I think of it like a battery. You know, there's 2 witnesses. We have the witness of the Holy Ghost and the witness of the prophet. And we need both of these 2 lines of revelatory communication to be able to know that the revelation we receive is in harmony with the Lord. Under this new ritual that sort of suggests more of a spiritual readiness idea to me, and I'm seeing more of like a direct communication happening or like a direct line happening. The way that I thought of it was, under this structure, if Eve's the bride, then Adam could represent Jesus and the bridegroom in the motif, and Jesus could represent God the Father. And the friend has now brought the bride to the wedding. And that's why we're seeing them side by side, Adam and Eve side by side, and this like direct covenanting each individually, instead of like Eve to Adam, Adam to the Lord. And so in this way, going off of the Hebrew wedding tradition and this marriage motif lens, it seems as if the son has collected his bride and presented her to the father. And this idea of like an intermediary for communication isn't really represented there anymore. And so to me, it suggests that maybe this just is something that's not going to be needed anymore, because when the marriage begins, this means that the Lord is here. And, at the beginning of the millennium with a capital M, when Jesus comes in glory, he's going to be in our presence. So we will have a direct access to him physically in person with our own eyes. And so I don't know, this is the thing that has been coming to my mind a lot as I've pondered on just how things used to be when I would go to the temple versus how it is now. And it's hard for me not to look at that and see some progression in a positive way. It seems like collectively we're saying that we've ascended a little bit higher and we're getting closer to the Lord and to that moment where we will be side by side with him. And I don't know, that was the idea that was coming to me with regard to how this structure has changed just slightly. And I think that both ways you can gain all kinds of insights and understanding, where some have criticized it or spoken ill of this whole change. I felt like it was kind of exciting because it just seemed like, okay, this is really different, and it's like a very small change, but it suggests a different idea. And to me, that idea, at least what was coming to me, was this concept of like a preparation phase, which is that separation after the betrothal, and then moving up into when the actual ceremony takes place. So we're moving out of that aruzen or betrothal, which includes that preparation and separation of 1 year between the bride and her bridegroom. And then we're moving to the Kiddushin, which is the actual wedding ceremony. And so that's where my mind has gone with it. And I wanted to pose this as food for thought, of just an example of how this marriage motif lens can just, I don't know, like open up your mind and give you eyes to see things that maybe would be a little harder to see otherwise. So the next thing we want to talk about in this video is going to be some of these changes that have been made with the clothing part of the ritual experience in the temple, and particularly with robes and shoes. So under the old ritual, which to me has represented this idea of preparing spiritually, versus how things have been changing under, I think, really just President Nelson. It's been mostly since he became the prophet that these big changes have come, where it seems to suggest this idea to me of more of a readiness. We saw that the former clothing ritual included both an Aaronic and a Melchizedek robe change, where this was incorporated in the ritual that would give you the idea of these two priesthoods, the preparatory priesthood, and then, of course, this higher priesthood that governs the church. And then with regard to shoes, these originally were incorporated in the ritual, and they have a lot of symbolism. And I'm going to talk about this in this video. And then under this new idea, this new ritual experience that we're having suggests to me more of a spiritual readiness, because the change that I'm seeing is that we're only looking now at this Melchizedek priesthood idea, this higher priesthood. And then shoes, they have some symbolism that's really important that to me speaks more to preparation versus like readiness. And since those are no longer incorporated as part of the ritual experience, I feel like it's suggesting more this idea of readiness. So let me illustrate. We've got this preparatory priesthood idea, this higher priesthood idea, these shoes as a symbol of entering holy ground, and shoes as a symbol of a sacred transaction. And this, to me, falls under the idea of preparation. And the reason why is because it's emphasizing that there's a preparatory priesthood before receiving this higher priesthood, and it's also emphasizing this idea of entering holy ground, which is what shoes symbolize. So if you go back to the marriage motif and you think about when we talked about how when people would come into the wedding, they would take off their shoes. In fact, even when people entered someone's home, they would take off their shoes. And you see this all throughout, particularly the New Testament. You know, they'd come in, they'd take off their shoes, and oftentimes somebody would wash their feet or they would wash their feet. And so there's this whole idea of shoes being taken off when you enter a home, especially sacred space or holy ground. And then there's this other story that I'll get into, which I've shared before on this channel in my first Hebrew wedding motif series. There's a paper that I'll pull from by Alonzo Gaskell, and it's about Ruth, and it talks about a shoe ceremony. So we'll get into that, but it suggests the idea of a transaction. And again, this is preparation, because you complete a transaction before you can obtain whatever it is that you're transacting for. And then with regard to the new ritual that we're doing in the temple, this new ritual experience with all these little adjustments and tweaks to the way that the ritual is happening, I see this idea of readiness, because with the omission of this Aaronic preparation robe symbolism and moving directly to this Melchizedek symbolism, it to me speaks of like a spiritual maturity and this greater priesthood responsibility. And then it also speaks to me a little bit about the shoes, that we're no longer being incorporated because perhaps this symbolizes that we've fully entered this holy ground, and that this transaction is complete or about to be completed. And so that's how I started thinking of it, and it's really because of this motif. If I didn't know this about how shoes are used in the Hebrew wedding tradition and with regard to covenant transactions, then I don't know that I would have been able to see that. Footwear and the transition from Aaronic to Melchizedek robes. If we look at Exodus 3 verses 4 through 5, it says, "And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Draw not nigh hither, put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground." So we see that when we enter holy ground, we take off our shoes. Ruth chapter 4 verse 7 says, "Now this was the manner in former time in Israel concerning redeeming and concerning changing, for to confirm all things. A man plucked off his shoe and gave it to his neighbor. And this was a testimony in Israel." So that's what we're seeing in this picture here, where we have a man sitting down and another man handing him his shoe. This was to confirm all things. So these two men have confirmed some type of a transaction or covenant that they're making with each other. And this usually has to do with land. And we saw that in the story of Ruth, where Boaz is having to be the kinsman who takes care of Naomi and Ruth when none of the other kinsfolk want to do this for them. And so we get this story from, it's actually in Ruth, I think chapter 3 is where it starts. The older temple rituals involved shoes and changing robes, which may have represented different stages of spiritual progression. These actions might symbolize the transition from preparatory covenants, the Aaronic priesthood, to higher covenants, the Melchizedek priesthood. In ancient Hebrew tradition, removing one's shoes was an act of humility and reverence, often signifying that the person was standing on holy ground, as with Moses at the burning bush in Exodus 3:5. In temple ritual, the actions pertaining to shoes and robes may have symbolized the preparation for holiness and the eventual full reception of priesthood power. However, with the removal of these symbolic actions in the newer temple ritual, the focus may now be on the unity of the covenants rather than on stages of progression. The absence of changing robes or incorporating shoes may signal that the church is ready to enter the presence of Christ without further preparation, a step toward the final union that the bride or the church is preparing for, a pattern of ascension. The ceremony of the shoe in ancient Hebrew tradition was a symbolic act of property transfer or covenant making, often associated with the transfer of land or the fulfillment of legal obligations. In this ritual, one person would remove a sandal and hand it to another, signifying the relinquishment of rights or authority over the property or covenant. The act of removing shoes represented humility and submission, often tied to sacred transactions. This custom is mentioned in Ruth 4:7, which we just read, where Boaz fulfills the law by redeeming land for Naomi. The ceremony emphasized the binding nature of agreements and reinforced communal values of honor and respect in covenant making, tying into broader biblical themes of sacred relationships and ownership. This ritual parallels the removal of shoes in spiritual contexts, such as Moses at the burning bush, further linking the act to reverence and submission in holy settings. The use of shoes, especially in temple rituals, can thus be seen as part of this ancient covenant tradition, emphasizing preparedness and sacred participation in divine agreements. Leviticus 7:33 says, "He among the sons of Aaron that offereth the blood of the peace offerings and the fat shall have the right shoulder for his part." Numbers 18:17-20 says, "But the firstling of a cow or the firstling of a sheep or the firstling of a goat thou shalt not redeem. They are holy. Thou shalt sprinkle their blood upon the altar, and shalt burn their fat for an offering made by fire, for a sweet savor unto the Lord. And the flesh of them shall be thine, as the wave breast and as the right shoulder are thine. All the heave offerings of the holy things, which the children of Israel offer unto the Lord, have I given thee, and thy sons and thy daughters with thee, by a statute forever. It is a covenant of salt forever before the Lord unto thee, and to thy seed with thee. And the Lord spake unto Aaron, Thou shalt have no inheritance in their land, neither shalt thou have any part among them. I am thy part and thine inheritance among the children of Israel. Zechariah 3:3-5 says, Now Joshua was clothed with filthy garments and stood before the angel. And he answered and spake unto those that stood before him, saying, Take away the filthy garments from him. And unto him he said, Behold, I have caused thine iniquity to pass from thee, and I will clothe thee with change of raiment. Doctrine and Covenants, section 109:76. That our garments may be pure, that we may be clothed upon with robes of righteousness, with palms in our hands, and crowns of glory upon our heads, and reap eternal joy for all our sufferings. Revelation 7:13-14. And one of the elders answered, saying unto me, What are these which are arrayed in white robes? And whence came they? And I said unto him, Sir, thou knowest. And he said to me, These are they which came out of great tribulation, and have washed their robes, and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. 2 Nephi 9:14. Wherefore we shall have a perfect knowledge of all our guilt, and our uncleanness, and our nakedness, and the righteous shall have a perfect knowledge of their enjoyment, and their righteousness being clothed with purity, yea, even with the robe of righteousness. What's happening here is we're seeing a transition. We're seeing the right shoulder, and I want to call your mind back to Isaiah 9:6, which we talked about at the beginning of this series of videos, because President Nelson mentioned in his talk in October 2024 that verse of Isaiah 9:6, which is the one that says, And the government shall be upon his shoulder. And he used this in the context of the second coming of the Lord and asked us to prepare. And we discussed this in previous videos as part of the Hebrew wedding tradition. So one part of the ceremony that would take place would be where the bride would rest her veil on the right shoulder of the bridegroom. And this was symbolic of the idea of her coming under his house, his name, his protection, and essentially his government. And the right shoulder represented the shoulder of burden, so bearing the burden. And this includes the burden of priesthood, the burden of government, and the burden of father, of family, as well as the keys. The keys would often be borne on the shoulder, the right shoulder. So there's a lot happening there with this idea. And then we also have, I think some of the more obvious ideas are right here in Numbers. We have the right shoulder mentioned again. We have the idea of the breast. We have the idea of blood upon the altar, a firstling, or the first born. We have this idea of holy offerings. We have seed mentioned, and also the covenant of salt. So think of salt that's lost its savor being a covenant curse motif, and then salt that adds savor, like what's described here, is a covenant blessing and a covenant promise. And think about how the gospel is supposed to go forward. We're like the salt of the earth, the leaven in the bread in the last days, in the time of the restoration. And this comes mostly through first Joseph, who is represented in Ephraim and Manasseh, and they gather the rest of the house of Israel, and then they carry that gospel covenant forward to everyone. And this has all been represented in all of these different archetypes that we've been looking at. And so I hope that you're seeing the buildup here of how this is all starting to come together. And it really is being seen, at least in my eyes, through the lens of this motif, even in the temple. In these next verses that we looked at with Zechariah, Doctrine and Covenants, Revelation, 2 Nephi, this is talking about robes of righteousness. We're talking about a changing of robes and what this signifies. This signifies a pattern of ascension. And when we think about the fact that we're no longer utilizing and incorporating shoes and this first change of robes into our temple ritual, it's, I don't know, I think through the lens of the marriage motif, what it teaches me is that something's happening here. There's a shift with us collectively as a church, that we are needing to ascend. We need to move from this preparation phase into a stage of readiness to go forth and do the works of Abraham, gather Israel, and then take that message to everyone else, everyone who's willing to come and be a part of this covenant. This is sort of like the progression, if you will, of the gathering of Israel. And I see this change as sort of representing and being a reflection of where the church is at now in this process of gathering, in the stages of gathering. And think back to the harvests that we talked about in previous videos, and the night watches, and just that parable of the 10 virgins. The call comes at midnight. The night gets darker as you move along from sundown to sunup, and the harvest season, each crop becomes more difficult to harvest as that season goes on. It's like we start out with this barley where it's a light shaking, and then the wheat where it needs this heavy beating and threshing. And then we need to get into like the grapes and the olives, which need crushing, and olives need 3 presses. And it's like this intensity. And then think about the labor motif of the woman in labor and the progression of the contractions and the pain and all of those things that go along with giving birth, and that buildup of, intensity that leads to the actual moment when this beautiful new child is born and comes through the veil of forgetfulness into mortality. And it's just all of these ideas are kind of coming together in the temple. And especially as we see the temple ritual being adjusted in a way that suggests that we're kind of moving through the temple into just a more state or stage of readiness. It's just, this is the idea that as I look through this specific lens, I cannot help but see. And so I'm kind of curious if anyone else sees this. It could just be something that I'm seeing, but I'm only seeing it because of this motif. I don't think that I would have seen it if I hadn't been studying this specific idea of the marriage motif. So I want to look a little bit at some more extra biblical literature. We've got the Ascension of Isaiah, which I think is one of the most amazing, coolest stories of maybe all apocryphal literature. I mean, we looked at the story of Joseph and Asenath, which is another really beautiful story. But I think the Ascension of Isaiah is just really neat. It's hard to explain. It feels so temple driven, and it's like the idea of just becoming pure and becoming holy and ascending from this mortal state to the very highest state that we can become, like reaching our highest potential. And that's the story that I get from the Ascension of Isaiah. And I want to focus on just a few chapters here. We're going to be pulling from chapters 7 through 9, which is the vision of Isaiah, is how it's labeled. And we're going to think about it with this idea of these robes and shoes, these changes in particularly robes, because that's what's mentioned here, are garments and robes. So in the Ascension of Isaiah, there's these references to changing garments and receiving heavenly robes, and this is all found in these chapters 7 through 9. And this is where Isaiah is ascending through the heavens. In these chapters, Isaiah sees the righteous being clothed in heavenly garments that symbolize their sanctification and transformation into a higher spiritual state, which is a little bit of what we saw described in these previous verses that we just looked at. And additionally, he witnesses those people who are in the seventh heaven, who have been stripped of the garments of flesh and are clothed in the garments of glory, awaiting thrones and crowns. And remember, in our story of Joseph and Asenath, we saw that Asenath was undergoing a very similar transformation as she goes through this repentance process. And remember how that apocryphal story described her as being told by the angel that her name would be in the book of life, and that she had her countenance change, and the way that it was describing her face being of light and her eyes being like the sun, and just it described what sounds like a celestial being. And that's kind of what we see happening here with the ascension of Isaiah. And then remember, she's anointed, she's crowned, she becomes the bride of Joseph in Egypt. And he has this high status. I mean, he's second to Pharaoh only. And I think if you look at Pharaoh representing God the Father, Joseph representing Jesus Christ, and Asenath representing the church, then we have a greater understanding for this idea of holiness, of ascension through these seven heavens that Isaiah goes through. So let's look at a couple of verses here. The ascension of Isaiah, chapter 8, verses 14 through 15, describes Isaiah being promised a heavenly garment, which he would receive when he's made equal to the angels of the seventh heaven. And he said, "Hear furthermore, therefore, this also from thy fellow servant, when from the body, by the will of God, thou hast ascended hither, then thou wilt receive the garment which thou seest, and likewise other numbered garments laid up there thou wilt see. And then thou wilt become equal to the angels of the seventh heaven." So we see him getting a garment and receiving a change in his status, in his glory. In the Ascension of Isaiah, chapter 9, verse 8, it speaks of the righteous, including Enoch, being stripped of their earthly garments and clothed in heavenly robes, symbolizing their transformation and glorification. It says, "And there I saw Enoch and all who were with him stripped of the garments of the flesh. And I saw them in their garments of the upper world, and they were like angels standing there in great glory." And so here we see that Isaiah is seeing Enoch. And so you can think of the city of Enoch, and we see the idea of these earthly garments, or like the garment of flesh, being stripped away and then receiving garments of the upper world. And think about how Enoch was translated, and so was his entire city. So we see that they become like angels standing in great glory, and this is represented by this symbolic garment, these earthly garments being stripped away, and then they receive these new garments, or essentially new bodies, new translated bodies. And so I think this, again, helps us see how the idea of changing garments suggests that we're ascending from one state to another state. And obviously, the state of the flesh is a preparatory state. And then this state of a translated immortal body, this upper world body, as it's noted, suggests that there's a higher state, a higher glory. It's likened to the angels' glory. And so we're seeing how the garment change represents ascension, moving from one state of being to another. And again, this speaks to me about the idea of preparation versus readiness. And if you think about the millennium and the second coming, I mean, we will have to be in some type of a translated state or resurrected state to be able to be there with the Lord for the millennium. Verses 10 through 12 add insight about the second coming in glory. It says, "But they sat not on their thrones, nor were there crowns of glory on them. And I asked the angel who was with me, how is it that they've received the garments, but have not the thrones and the crowns? And he said unto me, crowns and thrones of glory they do not receive till the beloved will descend in the form in which you'll see him descend. Will descend, I say, into the world in the last days, the Lord, who will be called Christ." So here we see Isaiah building on that idea of Enoch and his people being translated, and he's like, well, how come they haven't received their crowns of glory? And his angel guide is telling him that the reason they haven't received their crowns of glory is because they're not going to receive them until the second coming of the Lord in the last days. So this gives us an idea of, one, what the city of Enoch is looking like right now. People who are translated, who are in a state of glory that's like the angels, but that they're awaiting to receive their crowns, and that those crowns of glory will be added to them when the Lord descends at his second coming in glory in the last days. So again, this speaks to the idea of like a preparation versus a readiness. And Enoch's people are in a state of readiness. They're ready to receive the Lord at his second coming, and they're waiting. And so again, it suggests this concept of us here on earth right now, with this idea illustrated in the temple, where we see robes and like the omission of this first preparatory robe occurring in our temple ritual. It just reminds me that there's one concept of being in a state of preparation and another in a state of readiness. And I can see here that Enoch's people are in a state of readiness, and perhaps through the lens of this marriage motif, we too are moving out of a preparatory state into a state of readiness to receive our bridegroom. Which to me, if I think back to the parable of the 10 virgins, the call comes and it's like, hey, everybody get ready. Or if you think about the harvest motif, at the end of the season, they have to be ready for that call to come, because they don't know the day or the hour, but they do know the season and maybe even the week, if you get into the woman in labor analogy. So do you see how this marriage motif helps us to kind of gauge the state that we may be in collectively if the church is the bride and Jesus is the bridegroom? I hope that those connections are starting to form in your mind as we move along through this presentation, because this really is like the exciting build-up that I'm hoping will provide a little bit more food for thought when you go to the temple. The main takeaways is this idea that robes and shoes no longer being utilized and incorporated into our temple ritual the same way suggests that something's different, something's changed. And before, we had this robe change that sort of suggested the idea of preparation, there being like a preparatory stage or state, including entering sacred ground and, initiating a transaction, as well as receiving like a preparatory priesthood. And then the omission of these things from the way that we currently practice our temple ritual, to me, suggests that we're moving from this spiritual preparation phase collectively as a church, which I think is suggested by the temple ritual itself, into more of a spiritual readiness phase. So we're essentially saying, hey, we've grown and we're moving into this higher state of readiness as we are prepared to function in this higher order, this higher level of priesthood. And we're not leaning on this preparatory priesthood anymore. We're moving up and ascending. And same with the shoes. It's like we're not entering holy ground anymore. We are on holy ground. And we aren't in the middle of completing a transaction anymore. So we're not taking off our shoes and handing them to signify that we're completing this transaction. That is done. And now the transaction is complete. And I know that there's people who have different opinions about the events of the second coming and how those things are supposed to go down. Everybody seems to have an opinion about it. Even among the brethren, there's quotes that share all sorts of opinions about Adam Ondai Amen and the events of the second coming and exactly what that looks like. However, there are at least 4 key appearances of Jesus Christ that are noted just in the Institute Manual, and this is something that seems to be agreed upon collectively by the brethren, and that is that first, Jesus appears at Adam Ondai Amen. And there's a whole video I did about Adam Ondai Amen where we literally just look up all this commentary that I've collected about it over the years. And there are differing opinions on it. Some of those opinions are that it's really just the prophets and apostles that will know. Others have opinions that it's like a great sacrament meeting. And the biggest takeaway that I had in collecting the commentary, reading through it, studying it, is that it kind of seems like both, that it could be a series of meetings. This idea of series of meetings was suggested by Bruce R. McConkie. And it sort of pulls all of those different opinions together into one idea. And then the next would be that Christ appears to his people. And this is the idea of the New Jerusalem, Christ appearing in the New Jerusalem. Now, he has been appearing since the first vision, obviously, and he's appeared at his temples. And so, again, there's differing opinions about what that looks like. If there's like this specific literal fulfillment that needs to occur at a specific temple in the New Jerusalem. There's varying opinions on this, and that's not what this video is about, so I'm not going to get into that. But I want to point out these 4 appearances because these are the things that are clearly agreed on by the brethren, by the church. It's been taught in the Institute Manual for literally decades. And that is Adam Ondai Amen, Christ appears to his people, the church, and this is symbolically represented in the idea of the New Jerusalem. And then also to Old Jerusalem and to the Jews. And this is a huge part of the second coming. It's described in Zechariah. It's described in Doctrine and Covenants. It includes the Mount of Olives and Christ appearing there. And then there's some kind of unknown amount of time that seems to elapse. It could be short, it could be long. It's really hard to say, but there's an agreement that these 3 appearances and then the 4th and final appearance is after the heathen nations are gathered. So it's first Ephraim and Manasseh get gathered, and then they gather the rest of the house of Israel. That includes Judah. And then the house of Israel goes out and gathers out of the heathen nations, meaning the non-Christian nations, the ones who are the last to receive the gospel. And this ties into Daniel chapter 2, and it's like the reverse order because it shows the statue going from head down to the toes and then falling down, toes up to the head. And so there's like a reverse order happening in terms of how these nations rise and then how they fall. And this pertains somewhat to the gathering of Israel. And so that last final phase of gathering happens after Judah's gathered. And then Christ appears to the whole earth in glory. And so these are the 4 key appearances. And you can look this up in the Institute Manual. I've done videos on this too, but I'm bringing this up because in connection with this idea of spiritual preparation and spiritual readiness, it's clear to me that in order to complete the gathering of Israel, we have to move spiritually from this kind of preparatory phase, even just in our own testimonies, in our own ability, our willingness to commit, to a higher state of readiness, that the time for preparation is past or passing us by, and we really need to be ready. And I see this reflected in the messages from President Nelson, for example. So, he's said that in coming days, we will not be able to survive spiritually without the gift of the Holy Ghost. He's counseled us that we need to be prepared for the second coming of the Lord in this last conference talk in October 2024, and that we need to help prepare the world. So these ideas, to me, seem to match very well with what the prophet is counseling us. And this idea that we need to move out of this preparation phase into a state of readiness seems very strong in the themes that I see happening through the marriage motif lens when I look at the conference talks, the temple rituals, and even just the gospel in general, like when we talked about the restoration in a previous video. So I hope that helps to, I think, just provide food for thought is what I'm hoping, that you'll see the marriage motif lens as this really interesting and unique way to gain additional insights about how we can prepare for the second coming of the Lord, and how we can view our covenant relationship with Jesus Christ, and maybe even what our specific role is in this greater plan. And in the next video, we are going to talk about the veiling and unveiling of the bride. And I want to look at specifically veils in the temple and how this has changed and what this might say. So I hope you'll stick around for that video. If you liked this video, please like it, and hopefully you'll have fun with this next video coming up. But that's all for this one.